Okay, I think I'm set up here now. Thanks everybody for coming. This is a real honor for me. I get the opportunity to talk after a couple of people who've had a massive influence on my career. Dr. Sam Fullendorf, who was a mentor to me and who I did my graduate and postdoc work with, and really helped set up this talk. And also John Briggs, who, although I've had less interaction with, has had a really big impact on my career, especially through just the work in the scientific literature. And I think a big thing that all of us are here to do as scientists is really advance the state of scientific knowledge in terms of our understanding of the causes and consequences of juniper encroachment in the Great Plains, and really how to deal with that. And that's kind of what Sherry asked me to talk about, are different ways of dealing with this problem that's occurring. And another point to make is that you can see how much of an improvement my figure or my photo is here over Sam Fullendorf's, for those that were here. And so, again, as you hear Sam kind of talking about and setting up some of the things that, in terms of his model, that's why you see in science a development and a progression. We're continually trying to advance where we're going in the state of knowledge. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as we get into issues with fire intensity and how that drives both encroachment into grasslands as well as restoration pathways. Okay, so when we look at this juniper encroachment issue, and first thing I want to do is summarize a couple of the things we've heard already among some of the speakers, especially with the John Briggs talk. There's a number of different consequences of this juniper encroachment, and it's across a wide array of ecosystem services. We have not only grassland biodiversity declining, but it's across multiple different types of taxa. We've got plant biodiversity, as Dr. Briggs mentioned, declining as you go from this transformation to grassland and juniper woodland. We have the same thing with birds, with Rob Chapman and Dave Ingalls data, where ultimately about 90% of grassland birds are lost at about 10% juniper encroachment. So it doesn't take much for this to happen. Yet we're seeing massive encroachment issues. We see the same thing with small mammals. So a lot of things endemic to grasslands are declining. We see that in the breeding bird survey. So all the data we're looking at, we're seeing this as a major issue. Even though above ground carbon sequestration is high, most of that carbon is above ground, so it's at high risk of loss as we get potential variability in climate. And that's some of the stuff they're talking about in juniper areas in Arizona. So we have high above ground carbon, but 90% of that carbon is above ground. And so we don't have a lot of differences below ground. So that's at risk for disease, wildfire, and rapid losses of carbon in this system. So we shouldn't necessarily think of that as a stable endpoint and maybe a massive carbon gain. Stream flow and groundwater recharge, there's studies that based on soil type show massive changes in stream flow and groundwater. Other areas, depending upon topographic factors, they're variable. One thing very important to this society, livestock production, and some of the work that Sam's done, you have massive decreases in. We have 75% of livestock production potential lost as we go from grassland and juniper woodland. So when you're in the southern Great Plains, a lot of livestock producers in that area have actually lost a large part of their economic enterprise as a result of this issue. And again, what have we heard Sam talk about and John talk about? This problem is moving north and west throughout the Great Plains. The other one that we don't hear much talk about, but that was alluded to earlier, is this idea of wildfire suppression potential. We actually are able to do some modeling to show this, and this provides a summary of it, but it's not like you can suppress all wildfires in grasslands. Clearly there's plenty that are out of our control, but in grassland we have the ability to suppress some fires. And the U.S. Forest Service guidelines is basically once you get to 11 feet flame lengths, so not even the height of this room, that's the limit at where we can use traditional suppression techniques to put out wildfires. Well, in juniper woodland, we just never see that. We're dealing with much higher fire intensities and much higher flame lengths. So it's another consequence of this conversion. And it's again just to highlight this issue. If this had happened overnight, we would be talking about this as the worst catastrophic disaster in the Great Plains since the Dust Bowl. But because it happened slowly over 40 to 60 years, it's still not on everybody's radar as much as it needs to be. Now the thing I want to do is frame this talk based on some recent philosophical discussions that are occurring in ecology and this term of intervention ecology. And this idea of intervention ecology is really to take and lessen our certainty on the past, lessen the stable state concept and some historical climax, and realizing that it was actually more variable, more complex, more unpredictable, and that the future is going to change as well. And how do we deal with this in the terms of how we traditionally look at managing these ecosystems? And one thing that's talked about by Richard Hobbs in this paper is, see if I can, oh, that's not the one I wanted. Hey, we're back. Is reactive intervention versus proactive intervention. And reactive intervention is typically what we're doing the most right now, especially what we're talking about in this society. We're reacting to the problem. So as juniper is increasing, we're actually reacting to that problem, trying to push it back, maintain that current ecosystem state or that desired state, or try and halt this process of woody encroachment in order to maintain that state that we want. Everything's about reacting. The other option, though, that we learned maybe most importantly from both the previous speakers is the concept of proactive intervention, where we're actually attempting to prevent that occurrence of all. So when we're actually doing fires to manage grasslands, both in a spatially temporal way and to try and manage other services that are dependent on that, a bonus is we don't have to deal with this juniper encroachment issue. It's actually solved by just having frequent enough fires. So a proactive role is actually very useful in terms of managing for this. And that's what we're going to start to show is a proactive viewpoint versus a reactive one. And I would just, again, make the point now. So we look at this grassland to juniper woodland transformation that's occurring in the Great Plains, especially in the southern end right now. And we're going to this juniper woodland, and what we ask at some point is, wow, we've got to step in and intervene. How do we get this back, right? The reactive mentality. So let's look at some examples. Proactive, if your specific goal is to limit juniper encroachment, one example would be haying. Now, most people don't hay for woody plants, but that would be one example of proactive management. You're actually trying to stop that process from even occurring. But as you move towards reactive, now we're bringing out the big guns, bringing out the bulldozers. This is actually an example from Sonora. This is what typically landowners are doing in that area. You get enough woody plants, now it's time to react, remove that brush, and try and shift that towards that grassland or savanna area again. And think about what this does. We just increased cost, increased difficulty, and so when you're moving from proactive to reactive, there's a lot of negatives in terms of what that does for producer. Other examples, proactive, goats. We heard this with browsing a little bit out of Sam's talk. This stuff's now been published as part of the work on the Sonora Experiment Station with Butch Taylor, and Brady Allred has this paper out. And you can actually have goats that are stocked at sufficient densities to really slow down that juniper encroachment. And in areas where they've stocked for long term, you actually see minimal encroachment in some areas. But again, we're not thinking about doing it in terms of juniper as a proactive sense. It just happens to be a coincidence of how some people are managing. But clearly that's not occurring very many places because we have juniper all over the Edwards Plateau of Texas. Well, what do we do when we react? Well, it's time to create super juniper eating goats. That is actually the name of these. They're selectively bred for goats that preferentially select juniper forage to browse. And here you can actually see a goat that's bent over a juniper tree. And again, this is a reactive, but this isn't going to shift that system back, right? Unless super juniper eating goats are actually like Superman and can fly to the top of the trees and start eating them. So again, very reactive process, more money, more intensive in terms of trying to address this issue. Many, many studies, proactive, in terms of using fire frequently enough to maintain grasslands and manage against this woody plant problem. As we move in this direction, now we're being reactive. And we're actually using fire in very extreme conditions in order to try to shift that system back. Because frequent fires under traditional prescriptions haven't been successful, we have to step outside and do something very different. So now we're dealing with social, ecological issues, policy issues, human population change, and the ability to actually do some of these treatments. And again, you just see it harder and harder as we move towards a reactive sense. And this is an issue, because this reactive approach is really a shortcoming from how we've been taught and how the literature talks about managing for ecological systems. And I just want to give an example from Holling and Meffy's Golden Rule for Natural Resource Management. this proactive, reactive, and how we traditionally try and manage for systems, are we really managing for the critical types and ranges of variation in resource systems in order to maintain their resilience? Or are we trying to maintain this at a steady state by trying to just, well, it's gone past where I want it, now let's try and push that back a little bit. But we're not really managing for that critical variability that's so important to so many of those ecosystem services I showed before. Well, what drives that variability and in resource systems is disturbance regimes. And so one thing that we hear a lot is, can we replace a type of something like fire, which has occurred and spatially temporally variable, has variable fire intensity associated with it, with something like brush management? And what I would like to be able to really get across, we should stop pretending that we can take a reactive management approach and try and replace something that is actually part of a disturbance regime that this system is adapted to and evolved with. And this is a difference between looking at a disturbance event, like one fire, and using brush management, which is typically looked at as an event, versus a disturbance regime. Is brush management or any reactive approach going to match how fire is temporally variable, its magnitude associated with intensity and severity, its spatial variability that occurs? Absolutely not. And there's things that require this. And so I really want to look at this in terms of how we're simplifying disturbance regimes in the Great Plains and how that's related to this juniper encroachment problem. Now, I already knew that our previous speakers would talk a lot about fire frequency and fire return interval, so this temporal component. And that's really important in terms of when you're starting without juniper, as that's increasing, you're able to use fire frequency in order to maintain that grassland-dominated system. But as you move away from that, now we're looking at magnitude, and that's what was echoed as well. And this is what I'm going to talk a lot about in terms of targeting that range of variability that used to actually occur on the landscape that we have decided to constrain as a result of our philosophies of resource management and what the implications are for that. So what happens when we simplify fire regimes? And I really want to focus on the wording here. You know, we haven't just reduced and suppressed fires. We have failed to maintain pre-EuroAmerican settlement fire frequencies. They didn't just, fires didn't just occur. They actually increased the occurrence of fire based on their ignitions on the landscape. So we've removed those ignitions and then suppressed it and decreased it further. And so we've seen some of these figures before. As we go towards more and more time without fire, we have this exponential increase in juniper cover, and this is again from John's earlier data. And so just as an example, you get just a couple years out of fire, this recovery, we have this classic tall grass prairie, high biomass system. And you get to about 12 to 15 years, you start getting into this juniper encroached area. When you're looking at just over 30 years, you're starting to get into much more of a juniper woodland. Eventually you get this closed canopy area where you've actually completely changed the fuel structure in that system. Again, echoing the previous talks that we've heard today. Now what happens is you get this herbaceous biomass decline, cut off on the right there, but this herbaceous biomass decline that's associated with increasing in juniper. And the point I want to make with this is that when you start to get over here, grazing management isn't going to take and start to increase fuel loads because trees are doing it. And so the idea that grazing management is associated with this increase is like we've heard with some of the other talks, is just false from the context of when we're in this kind of a system. You can't manage fuels to increase fire intensity enough. So we've got to start looking at different pathways. So what that's done, that relationship has actually been shown all around the world. And again, that was something John mentioned too. And was part of a proposed positive feedback mechanism that explains the grassland to woodland transformation. This is all over. So when we have this transformation, you remove fire, you increase woody abundance. That causes decreases in fine fuel load, which decreases fire intensity. So by the time you're reinstating fire intensity is insufficient to reduce that woody abundance, so they increase. You get further decreases in fine fuel load. And the grazers are interacting with this as well. And this is what was talked about as actually the mechanism for driving this global grassland to woodland transformation. And this is also what's then used in management recommendations in NRCS Ecological Site Descriptions in terms of we've gone from grassland to juniper woodland, and because of that and that feedback mechanism, we know that fire alone is incapable of restoring a grassland ecosystem. That was actually the recommendation for a lot of data I'm going to show you when I started my graduate work. And restoration requires extensive brush control, reseeding, and grazing management. Again, that reactive approach with extensive brush control. Now, the point I want to make with this is that this is how ecologists view the system. We're trained around grazers. We're trained around the effect that plants have on herbaceous biomass. And as a result, we've described that process, but we've completely removed how fire, the physical process of fire, and how it functions. And so we look at how that actually occurs, and we couple fire physics to fire ecology, we get a very different mechanism. So here you have the traditional positive feedback loop that I discussed before, and then here you have Byram's fire line intensity model linked to Rothermel's rate of spread model. Rothermel's model is based on the law of conservation of energy, and I just want to show that all this is mathematically related. So that's Byram's fire intensity model. So every arrow you see is actual mathematical function driving how fire functions in terms of its behavior. Rate of spread, heat of pre-ignition. You can see how all these are related. And the point I want to make is this is a highly quantitative model, and there's a reason we haven't applied it, right? As ecologists, we're not really trained to apply these kind of equations and linking this to this kind of a system. But what it can do for us is actually identify, based on this process, and based on the range of variability and conditions that occur in this mechanism, what can we target besides fuel load? Because again, as I mentioned, we can't increase fuel loading enough to actually have an effect on cause juniper mortality. That's something we've heard earlier. But maybe we can target moisture content. It's not being influenced by this feedback loop. This is just occurring as climate occurs. So can we target low fuel moisture conditions, which is traditionally not done in fire management, and actually have the effect that we're wanting from a restoration standpoint, try and push that system back. And so we actually did a study that looked at that. And what we had was when we burned under the conditions that everybody else did, that's typically done in ecological research, and this is typical of what we do in management, what you get is a few trees die, but you still have a juniper woodland. And this function here is all a result of the relationship between fine fuel load and juniper scorch. And when you get up to here, that's where you have mortality. So you can see in the back, these trees died, and that's because they had a lot of fuel load directly underneath their canopy. Here you have intermediate levels of scorch, so it had a little less fuel load. And here you have no scorch, and it had a lot less underneath that canopy. And this is what is actually reflected in a lot of our NRCS recommendations, is that we need a certain amount of fuel load in order to achieve our effect. Yet if we burn under different prescriptions, and the only thing that was different in this study was that we burned under lower fuel moisture conditions, we get very different fire intensities, and we obliterate that fine fuel threshold and that dependence on fuel load. No matter what the fuel load was, and we have the same range here, we result in complete scorch of juniper, and as John Briggs requested, here's more pictures of cedar dying on the landscape, and this is an example of how we can do that with fire. We absolutely can restore these kind of systems and start to trigger a more grassland-dominated area, but it's doing it in prescriptions that are very different than what we traditionally do. These kind of conditions were done in burn bans with government exemptions. So the kinds of flame lengths that we're talking about in traditional prescribed fires, typically stuff that a couple feet tall, nice, mild, low-intensity fires, easy to control, right? That perception. But we can absolutely design landscapes to control these fires as well. Well, the best way to describe this is when you leave the convention center, look about 5 stories up on the hotel rooms. That's the flame lengths we're dealing with, because we're actually getting active crown fires and rapid combustion of these juniper trees. So very intense fires, very extreme, but this is actually a trigger to start to achieve landowners' objectives. And again, using this for intervention in ways to restore grassland-dominated area. Now, when we look at those two treatments, what's interesting is that it's not a function of that fuel load, right? This is a function of how that mechanism's interacting to drive fire intensity and juniper mortality. So when we put this as a function of the surface fire line intensity underneath juniper trees, it didn't matter if it was part of that high fuel moisture treatment, where most of them were just beneath that threshold, but you had a couple trees dying as a result of having sufficient surface intensities. Whereas in the low fuel moisture treatment, basically everything's dying because essentially they're all on this side of that threshold. So again, it's just to make that point that it's a part of how fuel's properties and weather conditions interact to drive fire intensity, and Juniper is actually responding to that. And at very low levels. This is very low surface fire intensities. In fact, it's remarkably low. It's just that Juniper modifies the fuel underneath it so much that it's hard to get surface fires to carry through them. And that's what kind of buffers that system in terms of fire. But this is actually supported through Van Wagner's crown scorch in conifers. He has the exact same threshold associated with complete scorch of conifers when your foliage is at ground level, like juniper trees. So this is really supported by some of that fire science work as well. So that gives us an indication of what we should target in management if we're actually going to try and use fire to react to this juniper encroachment issue. But I want to highlight another context and make this even more complex. What we have here in that previous study was just associated with growing season fires. Well, what happens if we have growing versus dormant season? That's a common question that we get. And this is a recently completed study with John Weir at just west of Stillwater, Oklahoma. And you can see you have these mature juniper trees in this previous grassland environment. And the point I want to highlight here is that we actually tried to target surface fire intensities being equivalent between the growing and dormant season. Because you have all these confounding factors when you're looking at growing and dormant season fire ecology research. So can we keep fire behavior the same? Then we just have the environmental conditions that are different. And that can explain why we're seeing differences in the treatments. And the key difference that we had was temperature being 22 degrees Celsius higher when we conducted our fires in the growing season. So that's important to remember as I show you the data. So the key that same surface fire intensities, temperature being much higher, we had much higher mortality in the growing season than the dormant season, which based on that current threshold I showed you is like, well, but as long as they're over that threshold, we should get mortality, right? Well, why that's true for that growing season fires that we had, what we have here is growing season doubling the reduction in density, doubling the mortality that occurred. And so when we started to look at the some of the fire science literature in conifers, this is actually Van Wagner's equation for crown scorch. This is the temperature of the fire relative to the ambient air temperature. So when surface fire intensities are similar, you really get this function of temperature driving this effect. And so given the same fire intensities as predicted by this equation, we did double the effect of the fire because we had so much more scorch. So if you're burning under conditions that achieve the same fire intensity, you're much more likely to actually meet your objectives in the growing season than the dormant season. But if you're in a type of environment where dormant season fires are more likely to get higher intensities than the growing season, then you should target those growing season fires. So it highlights this interaction between intensity and temperature is driving this effect. And this is really important because in Texas, this supports why they're using growing season fires so much. They're able to they're more likely to have high intensity fires, and they also have these higher temperatures, so they're getting much more of an effect in those kind of systems. But as you move north into like Kansas, Nebraska, potentially into the Dakotas, it's much more of a C4 dominated system than a C3, C4 co-dominated one. And so you kind of have a much harder time getting those intensities that you want. And so dormant season fires could on average give you more of an effect, even though you have to account for the fact that you're burning in lower temperatures. So again, it's just to make this issue about, we have a much more detailed understanding of what's driving some of the effects that's occurring in these juniper woodlands and how fire can be used specifically to start to cause mortality. And we're really working towards getting that transferred over to where we can use that in management and really target specific conditions. So I want to just kind of step back and summarize some of this information in terms of how humans currently use fire and what the implications are when we're dealing with this grassland and juniper woodland transformation. We've moved past the point where we're no longer saying that fire can't be used to kill cedars, right? We can take mature stands and kill that stand based on targeting certain conditions. But we have to go outside of what's typically been done. So what are the implications of how humans are currently using fire? And I'm just going to give 3 broad classifications here. The first main point that I want to discuss is that this grassland to woodland transformation is absolutely social. The ecological processes that are taking place are largely the same, with the caveat that we have these changing climatic conditions and nutrification of these systems. But it's us that's driving it. When we look at this, modern changes in human use of fire is what's really driving this process. So when you had Plains Indians, this solid line here, this is the theoretical fire occurrence that would occur if humans weren't even on the planet. So of course we don't know what that actually exists because we've been here, right? So this is the theoretical occurrence. Well, Plains Indians fire ignitions increase that occurrence of fire. And that increases even more. We have much more of an opportunity to manipulate this system as we move across the climate gradient from semi-arid to subhuman. And so that's why we've seen in the eastern part of the Great Plains so much of a rapid increase in juniper encroachment, because we took from here and decreased this below the theoretical potential that would occur. So not only did we remove ignitions, we've actually decreased it, and that's been also the interaction with fire suppression, intensive grazing, fragmentation. All those are feeding into how fire is functioning on this landscape. And that's our decision and our choice. That's a pre-EuroAmerican, we weren't doing that. We used fire completely differently. And that's reflected in how this transformation from grassland to juniper woodlands occurred. So about 5,000 years ago to about 150 years ago, fire was often occurring on the landscape as a result of human activities. We removed that, and we start to have this juniper woodland transformation occurring. And that's why you see papers talking about all over the world that in the absence of human fire ignitions, we're going to lose a lot of our temperate and tropical grasslands and savannas. So again, just to highlight this point, this is us that's caused the change and how we use fire. Now, we haven't just altered how we use it. One of the biggest points I think we can start to acknowledge is that we are the first humans in the history of the planet to actually universally across the globe attempt to constrain fire as a biophysical process, universally trying to minimize it. And so what we have, of course, is propaganda, and this is all over the world, but the Smokey the Bear campaign here in the US is, of course, a classic one. Only you can prevent this madness from occurring. There's a nice book by Julie Courtwright that came out recently for the Great Plains that talks about a very similar sentiment. Stop the madness. If we can prevent fires from occurring, we will create this Garden of Eden. And I suppose Eden was full of juniper trees then, because that's what we're getting. Similarly, even when we can use fire, we're under burn bans across all the state. There's counties in Texas that are permanently in burn bans because of the threat of wildfire. Others, occasionally you're in conditions where they'll let you burn, but we constrain it based on the legal system. And I know Larry's going to talk more about policy as well following this. And then, oh, well, no, now you're not in a burn ban. So now you can conduct prescribed fires, finally. But you have to do it under this prescription. You have to do it under this narrow range, and now you're okay. Now you can do it. Again, universally constraining fire is a biophysical process. And so we're not even considering the influence of fire intensity from an ecological research standpoint or in management. We have a good understanding of fire frequency, but we really haven't focused in on those two aspects. So here in the green, this is I'm not a splitter. This is aboriginal extent of tallgrass prairie. So it includes like coastal tallgrass prairie all the way to the northern end. And this is 5,000 to 500 years before present approximation. And then we have current tallgrass prairie shown as the darker green. And what these numbers correspond to is the number of empirical studies that have measured fire behavior, any aspect, in tallgrass prairie. Now, tallgrass prairie is one of the most well-studied fire ecosystems in the world. And we haven't even thought of fire intensity. So we're not even considering variability in that component of the disturbance regime. And so it's no wonder we're failing to manage for a lot of these systems and failing to manage for this juniper encroachment issue. Now, what I want to do is show a recent model that we've completed that actually quantifies the extent that we've constrained fire behavior in tallgrass prairie. So here's the data from this study, and I'll walk you through it. On the top, we have fire line intensity. Here's flame length. Flame length and fire line intensity are correlated. So flame link's a little bit easier to be able to understand just because we think in terms of those numbers a little more. The red bar is that pre-EuroAmerican potential. So that's the theoretical potential fire line intensity and flame lengths that occurred. And so this is the realistic maximum that could occur in tallgrass prairie, so we didn't even know that. You know, how intense can things get? So that's the theoretical maximum based on our data. And this is a combination of fuels, weather, and it's just allowing the system to function. Allowing the system to, it didn't matter what conditions were possible, fires can just occur because there's no doubt that Plains Indians burned under a wide variety of conditions. They burned low intensity fires to extreme fires for war and driving game off so that they could actually gather food. And so it's not like it was just this low intensity system. Well, the modern policy effect is shown in purple. And in terms of fire line intensity, we've reduced the magnitude of this disturbance regime from pre-EuroAmerican settlement to how we use fire by 94%. That means that all of our research is right there. So our understanding of what fire can do is the bottom 7% or so of fire line intensity. And that's what we're doing in management. This is a result of policy constraints. All we did was say, here's our prescriptions of when we conduct prescribed fires. Those prescriptions reduce potential fire intensity, again, 93%. Well, let's compare this to other ecological processes that are being talked about all the time. Exotic invasions being talked about as changing fire feedbacks and resulting in much either greater or lower fire intensities. In this case, and this is some work that, data that I took from Devin McGranahan's paper, along with work he did with Dave Engel. This is tall fescue invasion, which is a cool season forage. Tall fescue invasion, it increases the fuel moisture in the fuel bed. So you have much higher fuel moisture, which reduces fire intensity. But it can fully cure in drought. So you still only get about a 50% reduction. So policy has a much greater effect than exotic invasion in this system. Let's look at effective juniper encroachment from 5 years to 40 years. And it takes 25 to 30 years of juniper encroachment before we have the same effect as policy and what we dictate when we can burn. And one of the biggest things that I think we've all learned today is that nothing grows under cedar trees about 25, 30 years after fire. So this is the same effect as if we removed basically 80% of the herbaceous production and said, this is only when you can burn. That's the same effect we've had in policy. Imagine that's the extent we've gone to try and minimize and simplify this disturbance regime. Well, that's a major issue, and that then carries over into to what our culture is. And we hear a lot about this even within this society. We're reacting to the woody plant problem in grasslands, but we're functioning within this socially constrained system. We're constrained in terms of how we can allow fire to function as a biophysical process in the system. So as we get this process of succession occurring over time, as we start to move in this direction, it's not like it's just extreme fire or no fire that is causing this. As this increases, your fire intensity is constantly increasing because you're getting taller and taller trees. So to completely scorch those trees, you're having to burn under greater intensities. So like John talked about, it's a gradient. And so as we're removing fire and reacting to this problem, we're making it harder and harder on ourselves. If we're using fire proactively, this is easy. When we're at this stage, fire is easily killing those smaller trees. It's as we move in this direction where fire intensity is getting harder and harder to do it. And the same thing with mechanical. You know, we're having to step in and show the big guns when we get to that Juniper Woodland. We're having to step in and use fire under extreme conditions. When I've talked about doing these fires, when we actually conducted these treatments, I called into places and they go, look, you know we have 6 wildfires occurring within a 30-mile radius of you that have been burning for a couple weeks, right? And the answer is yes, and we'll call you when we're done, because they had special exemptions, because that culture was starting to use fire to try and restore this grassland-dominated state. And why? Because we've talked about all the ecosystem services that have been lost in the Southern Great Plains. So you get to this level of desperation. Well, you know, we're going to have to react some way. And we're spending millions of dollars in the Southern Great Plains on mechanical reactive intervention. That's why it's still all juniper woodland and so much brush. So I would really, when we're looking at this, really target again what those previous speakers talked about. managing for fire frequency to be proactive in terms of this issue. Because if we're not, we're going to go in this direction, and then we're dealing with either much more expensive or much more extreme kind of intervention techniques. And I just want to highlight that this is actually something that's being done in certain areas. The problem is so great that places are getting exemptions from government burn bans to conduct these types of fires. So Sam showed a black and white map of Dave Ingalls and their map of the Green Glacier throughout the Great Plains. What's interesting is that we overlaid the map of prescribed burn cooperatives, and those are landowners helping each other burn in order to restore fire to the Great Plains. Look at how it's all where the juniper problem is. So they're restoring fire to the Great Plains, reacting to that juniper problem. And we've recently completed a survey, and basically all the surveys came back saying, we're trying to kill mature cedar. Yet only in a few areas are they going to be burning in conditions where they have that potential. And those are shown here in red, where they're getting government exemptions to burning conditions outside of traditional prescriptions and burn bans. And this is happening. This is Edwards Plateau data. They've conducted approximately 150 fires outside of traditional prescriptions in burn bans and burned about 80,000 acres over the last 7 to 10 years. So this is actually something that is occurring on the landscape because of the amount of degradation that's occurred as a function of juniper encroachment. And that's growing. In Oklahoma, there's now 4 other burn cooperatives that have received exemptions in the last couple of years. And if this process continues to go north, we would likely continue to see that level of social political change occurring as well. So again, just to highlight, man, isn't it much easier to be proactive than having to have this much change in terms of what we're targeting in conditions and what we're having to change in the social political system. So with that, I really appreciate everyone coming to the talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions.